Hey y'all, I'm Brandon Adams and welcome into this edition of Gimme 5. It's my turn this week to do it. It's one of my favorite new things we're doing here around Dog Nation because I'm genuinely interested in the questions you all ask, and whether it comes to my colleagues like Connor Riley or Mike Griffith, Jeff Sintel, who've been answering these questions, I'm always fascinated by the answers they provide, and hopefully I provide, a similar level of value to what I see the other folks around Dog Nation doing here. And, of course, some of this is written at dognation.com, and I hope you'll read that if you've kind of found this via the YouTube page. But we also want to do kind of that video component, too, because around here we just love doing video. So let me show you one of the questions I got this week. I'm going to do my best to try to give a good answer to it here today. It's kind of a two-parter, but I want to focus on the second part of this more. Will Reed writes in to say, will the offensive line rotation continue, or do they need to tighten down the line to just 5 guys? And he also asks, should the staff plug in the tight ends, such as Brock Bowers or Darnell Washington or Oscar Delp, at the X wide receiver position since A.D. Mitchell is currently injured? So the offensive line thing, I think some of that's still yet to be determined, and maybe we'll answer that at a different time. I want to focus more on that second question that Will asks about how the tight ends should be used, and specifically whether or not one of them should be what he calls like the X wide receiver position. Now, a lot of you understand this, maybe some of you don't. When people sometimes say the X wide receiver, that's sort of like a football version of shorthand now for your like alpha receiver, your top guy. I mean, technically, if you want to go to like the football X's and O's blogs and things like that, they'll tell you that by rule, in football, you got to have 7 guys on the line of scrimmage. The X receiver typically lines up on the line of scrimmage. Oftentimes, that's kind of what they call like the boundary side, or the side that's closer to the sideline because it's a shorter throw. The logic here being, if you have your best receiver closer to the quarterback, it's an easier throw for him to make, and therefore easier to get the ball to your best receiver there in that situation. I'm not an X and O's expert, but that's kind of the way in which I guess the football part of all that works. But what Will's really asking is, hey, should Georgia treat a guy like Bowers or Darnell or somebody like that as their top receiver, considering the fact that their actual top wide receiver, A.D. Mitchell's currently not playing, and you're left to believe that his injury is kind of lingering here a little longer than maybe some folks kind of wanted to. So I think it's important to note that Kirby Smart actually addressed the topic of how Georgia used its tight ends here this week. I want to read this to you a little bit. This is an answer to Will's question. He says, sometimes having similar bodies doesn't cause enough problems for a defense. It just sounds good. Everybody likes it because it sounds good. In addition, you have to have space players to create space. Some of our best plays have been space plays like Ladd McConkey or Kearis Jackson or Dylan Bell or Marcus Rosemy-Jacksaint. You have to have space players to play. I'm not saying that tight ends aren't, but you kind of start playing in a phone booth when you start doing 13 personnel. He means one, running back, 3 tight ends. He says, really, Darnell Washington's greatest attribute is his size and ability to do things in the run game and play action off of it. He says, Eric Gilbert's kind of similar in that regard. Brock Bowers is a little bit more of a space player, but I don't know whether there would have been any more of that, or not, basically playing that 13 personnel. So I think that's interesting, and this is where I have to acknowledge that there is a part of me that's obviously said over and over again, hey, Georgia should be using his tight ends more. Those are the best players on the field in often instances. That's certainly the deepest position group that Georgia has, and as many different opportunities as you can create for them, especially for Bowers, who I believe is a true alpha-type player. You got to be doing everything you can to do that. But this is where I think Kirby Smart's words probably deserve a little bit more of our attention, because what Smart's essentially saying here is that, yes, the Georgia tight ends may be great, but part of what makes them great is how they play off of the receivers. And while we may look at a guy like, some Georgia wide receiver as less overall valuable than what one of the tight ends is, it's the respect that you must pay to a quicker player, a guy that Smart says that can play in space. It's the respect you give to them that oftentimes create more opportunities for those Georgia tight ends. And if everybody looked the same, then all of a sudden you don't quite have that same ability to kind of play off someone else's strengths. In fact, I'll wrap up by saying this. If you go back to the game this season, which the Georgia passing attack was at its most dominant, the Oregon game, you see 9 catches for Kenny McIntosh, 5 catches for Ladd McConkey, 4 for a then-healthy A.D. Mitchell. Kearis had 3. Brock had 2. Dejon Edwards had 2. Darnell Washington had 2. And then Kendall Milton, Marcus Rosemy-Jacksaint, and even the late-game situation for Savon Clark, they all got 1. That seems to be kind of a blueprint for what Kirby Smart says he wants to do. Have those wide receivers out there playing in space, create the opportunities then for the tight ends to use the big bodies that give them their chance at success, and all of a sudden Georgia's got a multifaceted passing attack. Admittedly, we haven't seen that as much since the Oregon game, and I've kind of called for the tight ends to help propelled Georgia back towards that. But Smart says it's the way that all these guys work in concert with each other that really makes the passing game hum. Now, what's right, what's wrong, I guess the rest of the season will help determine that, but certainly more passing game success like what Georgia had to begin this season is definitely a big part of the rest of the Georgia story as they go for 2 here in 22 once again. Thanks for being a part of Gimme 5, and hope you enjoy the rest of the piece written there at DogNation.com.